Good to see all of you here this morning as we enter into this Palm Sunday together. So I have a kind of an off-the-wall question for Palm Sunday. It'll make sense in a little bit, but we're going to go a totally different direction for just a moment, and we're going to talk about Star Trek. All right, how many people have watched Star Trek episodes on TV, right? So we're talking about the TV Star Trek. Okay, so here's my question. If you were going to follow a starship captain into deep space, who would you choose to follow? There's actually 5 different captains you could decide to follow into deep space. So you've got Captain Kirk, the original. Remember Captain Kirk, some of you? Right, you remember Captain Kirk? He was the guy that would just rush into a fight and do whatever he had to do, and he just ran out there. He was kind of the adrenaline junkie. And then you had Captain Jean-Luc Picard, who was the diplomat, the statesman. You have Captain Catherine Janeway, who was like Moses leading the Israelites back across the Delta Quadrant, back to Earth, to the Promised Land. You have Captain Benjamin Sisko, who was more of a management style of leader. He managed a space station. They actually never went anywhere, but they actually managed in conflict and all that. And then there was Jonathan Archer, who was the explorer and the moral questioner of the universe and whether we should be doing this or not. And so he was kind of the reflective guy. So if you had a choice and you were going to go into space, which captain would you follow into deep space? Which captain would you want to hook your wagon to, so to speak, or be the leader as the one to lead you into space? How many people would go with Captain Kirk, if you'd go with Captain Kirk? All right, yeah. How many people would go with Jean-Luc Picard? Yeah, every service I've done said, there's a lot of hands that go up for, who said, how about Captain Catherine Janeway? Yeah, we got some good. That's good. Benjamin Sisko. Nobody wants Benjamin. We got one. We got a few. All right. Anybody? Okay, Benjamin Sisko. And then there's Jonathan Archer. Anybody would go with Jonathan? Okay, so that's good. So we look at that and we think, who would I follow? Who would I allow to lead? Who would I allow to do this? And some of the people that we choose to follow say something about the type of leader we want to follow. Say something about the characteristics of a leader that we're looking for. Now, I read a book several years ago called Good to Great by Jim Collins. And in that book, Good to Great, Jim Collins talks about the difference between good leaders and great leaders. That there are a lot of good leaders, but then there are these great leaders, leaders who produce and create these great organizations and great businesses. And that there are actually 2 characteristics that he points out that separate out good leadership from great leadership. And interestingly enough, the 2 characteristics might surprise you, because we tend to think, the leader is like the Captain Kirk or the Janeway or whichever one of those things. We think of those characteristics, but the 2 characteristics that Collins discovered in their research were 2 things. One was personal humility. Personal humility. Someone who wasn't doing things for themselves. They were actually trying to build a great organization or a great company. And in fact, they didn't really care if they got credit or not. They wanted to make sure that they built a great product or did something great for humanity or did something great for the business world. So they wanted to do something great for someone else, not for themselves. They didn't care. They weren't in it to make a name for themselves. And a lot of times, those CEOs that they studied were CEOs that you wouldn't know the names of. You know the names of their companies, and they're well-known companies, but you don't know their leaders because that's the way they want it. They don't want to be recognized. They have personal humility. It's not about them. The other characteristic is a resolve and a determined will to accomplish something, to have results. And that's the other part of this professional will. They're not people who quit easily. They don't give up. They're very determined to see that company or that organization be great, and they're determined to see that happen. And so as I read these 2 characteristics of great leaders, personal humility and professional will, as a pastor, I immediately thought of one of the greatest leaders on earth. You want to take a guess at who that leader is? Jesus, right. If somebody exemplified humility, it was Jesus. If somebody exemplified not a professional will in our minds, but a will, a determination, it was Jesus. He had both those characteristics. And that's why I think Jesus is a great leader, not just a good leader. And that's why I think Jesus is a leader worth following and committing our lives to. and saying, I'm going to make you the king of my life. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's what the disciples knew. The disciples knew him to be a great leader, and that's why they hailed him as their king and as the one who was going to lead them. But he wasn't coming as expected, was he? Because when he came into Jerusalem that day, he came riding on a donkey, which was a symbol of peace. He wasn't coming in like Captain Kirk phasers blasting. He was coming in as a king of peace. And he was coming that day as a humble king, not as one that was going to take control and take charge. So he had that personal humility. In fact, in Philippians, it says that he gave up his throne in heaven. It gave up being with God. He gave up that throne in heaven, and he came down to be with us. It literally says that he emptied himself. He emptied himself. He emptied himself not of being God, but he emptied himself of all of himself. In fact, when he was tempted earlier in the Gospel of Luke by Satan came and tempted him, and the temptations all had to do with Jesus doing something for himself. Feed yourself. Feed your desires, Jesus. Take your authority. Take control. Take charge. Or reveal God's protection over you. Throw yourself from this temple, from this pinnacle. Do something for yourself, Jesus. And in each temptation, Jesus refuses to do something for himself. Because why? Because he emptied himself of himself. Now, I've got a little illustration here this morning that might help us understand this a little bit. And so I've brought here a container. And you in the front row, is that full or empty? Full, right. So have you ever heard the phrase, you're full of yourself? Or he's full of himself, or she's full of herself. Have you ever heard that? You ever heard that phrase, right? And so we don't want to be that way, right? Nobody wants to think of themselves that way. And so life goes on, and we go, we know we ought to really be kind and nice to other people. So we say, hey, you know what? I don't want to be that person. So I'm going to pour a little bit of myself out. I'm going to be kind to some people today, or nice to some people. And then I also know I'm supposed to be charitable and generous and giving to others. And so I think, I could be a little generous. I could do some nice things or give away some things to folks. So I pour a little bit of myself out. And then, I think, well, I spend some time, I can help other people. I could do something. I could do a little bit. There's something I could probably do. So I spend a little time, and I might help somebody out in some way. And so I give a little bit more of myself. I pour a little bit more of myself out. And then I go, hey, I feel pretty good about myself. And what I do, is this still full? Well, I'm not going to ask the half full, half empty question. But it started out with 900 milliliters, now I got 600. So I still got quite a bit left. Now Jesus, what it says, Jesus emptied himself. Everything. He let it all go. He emptied himself of all but love for you and me. He emptied himself of himself. And that's what enabled him to not only be a great leader, but that's what enabled him to go to a cross. That's what enabled him to do the things that he did, because he was willing to let go of himself and empty himself so that he could serve God and serve God's purposes. He had an extreme personal humility that you and I tend to hold on to ourselves, where he let himself be emptied. Jesus also had a really determined will. He was really determined that day when he rode into Jerusalem. He was riding in, but he knew that day was coming. He was determined to get there. I don't know if you are familiar with the Glenn Cunningham story, but Glenn Cunningham was, when he was 8 years old, this is back in the old days when they went to schools and schoolhouses. And every morning somebody had to go in the wintertime and stoke the stove in the schoolhouse. And it was his job this particular morning to go and stoke the stove in the schoolhouse so that it would be warm in the classroom when all the kids arrived later that morning. But on this particular morning, as he was stoking the stove caught the building on fire. And he was burned from the waist down in that fire before someone dragged him out. He recalls laying in a bed and overhearing the doctor say to his mother, "We don't think he's going to make it." And inside of him, he said, "I don't want to die. I'm going to live." So he made a decision to live. And then a few weeks later, the doctors came to his mother again and said, "Your son's never going to walk again." And he said to himself, "I'm determined. I'm going to walk again." And so as life went on and as he got home and he got back into his house, he was sitting on his front porch, unable to walk. And he saw this picket fence that went around his yard. And as he looked at that picket fence around his yard, he made a decision to throw himself off the porch and crawl across the green grass and grab a hold of the white picket fence and pull himself up. And then he began to just will himself to walk again as he walked. And he would use the white picket fence to do that as he would go around. And they say he wore a pathway in the grass around that picket fence. And for 22 months he did that. And 22 months later he stood and he walked again. In high school, he actually joined the track team. And in college, again, he ran track. In 1934, he set the world record for the mile at 4 minutes, 6.8 seconds. He was able to do that because he was determined. He had a will that he focused. It's that same kind of will that Jesus focused that day in Jerusalem. It says in Luke chapter 9, verse 51, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. Earlier in the gospel, he had already determined that he was going to go there, and he knew what awaited him when he got there. And as he rode into Jerusalem, we didn't read this part in the gospel this morning, but do you know what happened to Jesus, what was going on inside of him emotionally when he got there, as he rode in on that donkey, as everybody was singing Hosanna and saying, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." You know what Jesus was doing? He was weeping. He was crying, not tears of joy, but sadness, because he knew what awaited him in Jerusalem, yet he didn't give up. He didn't quit. He was determined to go to the cross because he wanted to be obedient to God's plan and to be obedient to the salvation of the world, and because he loved us that much. He was determined. He was not the king we expected with taking authority. He was an obedient king, a king obedient to God's plan for his life. And because of this, both his humility and his will, it says in Philippians that God exalted him. That at the name of Jesus, every knee would bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And whether or not you and I actually believe that or follow that or think that, what Paul is saying, regardless, one day everybody will realize that, whether we realize it now. In fact, when the Pharisees came up to Jesus as he was riding into Jerusalem, what did they say to Jesus? What did they say to him? Remember what they said? Tell the disciples to do what? Be quiet, right? Stop saying all these things about, stop saying, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." You need to tell your disciples to be quiet. And Jesus says, if I tell them to be quiet, it's not really going to matter because you can't change who I am. Regardless of whether you acknowledge it or not, the stones are going to cry out if they don't. Because of who I am, we can't change that. Whether we believe it or not, we can't change that of who Jesus is. And that one day all of us will acknowledge that. So for right now, though, as we look at Jesus, this unexpected king who comes with humility and determination, who's obedient to death on a cross, we have to also think about, am I really want Jesus to be my king? Or is there no room for Jesus in my life? And that's really what was struggling with the people there of that day, is there were some who wanted to make him king, and there were others that were shouting, "Crucify him. He's not doing what we want him to do. He's not the leader we wanted. He's not the guy that we had hoped for. So just go put him on a cross." Because he doesn't have the characteristics that we want as a leader. And so they crucified him. So we have to think about that. Is Jesus going to be our king? Or just another would-be leader that we cast aside? So what reason can we give to follow Jesus, to make Jesus the leader of our lives? Well, there was a tour bus traveling through the English countryside, and they came to a village, a town in the English countryside, and the tourists started to get off the bus, and as they got off the bus, there was an older gentleman sitting there alongside a fence on a bench. And one of the tourists coming off the bus in a kind of a condescending and patronizing tone came up to the old man and said, "Well, so were there any great men born in this village?" And the old man said, "Nope, just babies." Because leaders are not only not born, they're shaped, they're molded. Because leadership, in a sense, is really about influence. And who we follow as our leader has influence over us. Whenever we make somebody the leader of our lives, whenever we say, "I'm going to follow you," we're actually saying to that person, "I'm going to allow you to influence who I am. I'm going to allow you to shape me, and I'm going to follow what you say and what you do, and I'm going to allow what you do and what you say to shape what I do and what I say." That's influence. And when we make someone the leader of our lives, and we all do this, we all have someone who's leading us, maybe even ourselves. But we all have somebody leading us. But the question we ought to be asking ourselves is, as we follow whoever that is, who are they shaping us into? Who are they making us into? And Jesus is a great leader who wants to mold us and to shape us and to help us be the people of God that God calls us to be. And that's why I make Jesus my king. That's why I've chosen to make Jesus the leader of my life. Because I know that as I follow him, I become better. I become molded. I become shaped in a way that no other leader has shaped before. Amen.